The Gemara asks, and can one not derive the halakha with regard to disqualified offerings from the halakha with regard to fit offerings? But isn't it taught in a bereta? From where is it derived with regard to an item that left the temple courtyard and was thereby disqualified, that if it nevertheless ascended upon the altar, it shall not descend? It is derived from the fact that an item that left is valid for sacrifice on a private altar. Here the bereta derives the halakha with regard to a disqualified offering from the halakha with regard to a fit offering. Okay, 49a. Menachot 49a. The Gemara answers, the Tana of that bereta relies on the phrase, this is the law of the burnt offering, ha'olah. It is that which goes up on its firewood upon the altar all night unto the morning. Leviticus 6:2. A seemingly superfluous general phrase which is interpreted homiletically to include the halakha that any item that ascends, olah, upon the altar shall not descend from it, even if it was disqualified. The verse is the actual source for the halakha of the bereta, whereas the case of a private altar is cited merely in support of this ruling. Accordingly, the bereta does not contradict the opinion of Rav Shimi bar Ashi. The Gemara cites another discussion concerning the sheep of Shavuot. Rabba bar Hana taught, a bereta before Rav, in a case of the two sheep of Shavuot, where one slaughtered them for the sake of rams, and not for their own sake, they are valid offerings, but they do not satisfy the obligation of the owner, i.e. the community, to sacrifice these offerings. Rav said to Rabba bar Hana, that is not so. Rather, the sheep certainly satisfy the obligation of the community. Rav Hizda said, the statement of Rav is reasonable in a case where one thought that they were rams when he slaughtered them, and nevertheless slaughtered them for the sake of lambs. In such a case, it makes sense that they satisfy the community's obligation, since the lambs were slaughtered for the sake of lambs. But in a case where he thought that they were rams when he slaughtered them, and therefore slaughtered them for the sake of rams, they do not satisfy the community's obligation, even though they were actually lambs. This is due to the fact that the erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering constitutes uprooting, despite the fact that it was done in error. But Rabbah said, the erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering does not constitute uprooting. Rava said, we raise an objection to our own ruling concerning this halakha from that which was taught in a Mishnah, Gittin 54a. In a case of priests who disqualified an offering through improper intention in the temple, by expressing, while sacrificing the offering, the intention to eat it after the appropriate time, if they did so intentionally, they are liable to pay the value of the offering to its owner, who must now bring another offering. It follows, therefore, that if the priest did so unintentionally, they are exempt. And it is taught concerning this case in a bereta, even though they slaughtered it with improper intent, unintentionally, their act of improper intention renders the offering pigul, despite the fact that they are exempt from paying damages. What are the circumstances in which this is the halakha? If we say that it is referring to a case where the priest knew that the offering was a sin offering, which is eaten for only 1 day and 1 night, and nevertheless he intended the offering to be for the sake of a peace offering, which is eaten for 2 days and 1 night, and thereby his intention was that it be eaten after its appropriate time, is this considered an unintentional act by the priests? Certainly they were acting intentionally. Rather, is it not referring to a case where the offering was a sin offering, which is eaten for only 1 day and 1 night, and the priest thought that it was a peace offering, and therefore he intended the offering to be for the sake of a peace offering, which is eaten for 2 days and 1 night, and thereby his intention was that it be eaten after its appropriate time. And with regard to this case, the Tana taught, their act of improper intention renders the offering pigul. Apparently, this proves that the erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering constitutes uprooting, contrary to the ruling of Rabbah. Abai said to Rava, there is no objection from this Bereta, because actually it is referring to a case where the priest knew that it was a sin offering, and nevertheless he intended the offering to be for the sake of a peace offering. And his uprooting was done intentionally. Nevertheless, the Bereta refers to the priests as acting unintentionally because it is referring to circumstances where the priest says, i.e., he mistakenly thinks that it is permitted to sacrifice the offering with this intent. Rabbi Ze'era raises an objection to Rabbah's opinion that erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering does not constitute uprooting. A Bereta teaches that Rabbi Shimon says, all meal offerings from which the handful was removed, not for their sake, are entirely valid, and have even satisfied the obligation of the owner, unlike animal offerings slaughtered not for their sake, which do not satisfy the obligation of the owner. This is because meal offerings are not similar to animal offerings. As in the case of one who removes a handful from a meal offering prepared in a shallow pan for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a deep pan. Its mode of preparation proves that it is a shallow pan meal offering and not a deep pan meal offering, since a meal offering prepared in a shallow pan is hard, and one prepared in a deep pan is soft. His intention is plainly false. Similarly, if one removes a handful from a dry meal offering, the meal offering of a sinner, which has no oil, for the sake of a meal offering mixed with oil, his intention is plainly false, as its mode of preparation proves that it is a dry meal offering. But with regard to animal offerings, this is not so. There is one mode of slaughter for all of the offerings, one mode of collection of the blood for all of them, and one mode of sprinkling for all of them, since the only factor that distinguishes between one type of offering and another is the intention of the individuals involved in its sacrifice. Their intention is significant. Consequently, if one of the sacrificial rites is performed for the sake of the wrong type of offering, the offering does not satisfy its owner's obligation. The Gemara clarifies, What are the circumstances to which Rabbi Shimon is referring? If we say that he is referring to a case where the priest knew that the meal offering was prepared in a shallow pan, and nevertheless he removed a handful from it for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a deep pan, then although its mode of preparation proves that it was prepared in a shallow pan, what of it? In any case, he is consciously uprooting its status as a shallow pan meal offering, changing it to a deep pan meal offering by means of his intention where he removes the handful. Rather, is it not referring to a case where the priest thought it was a meal offering prepared in a deep pan and therefore removed a handful for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a deep pan, but he was mistaken, as it was actually a meal offering prepared in a shallow pan? It is specifically here, in this case, that Rabbi Shimon rules that the offering remains valid, since its mode of preparation proves that it is a shallow pan meal offering, which indicates that in general, erroneous uprooting of the status of an offering constitutes uprooting, contrary to the ruling of Rabbah. Abai said to Rabbi Zierah in response to his objection, "This objection to Rabbah's opinion is inconclusive, because one can explain that the Baraita is actually referring to a case where the priest knew that the meal offering was prepared in a shallow pan, and nevertheless he removed a handful for the sake of a meal offering prepared in a deep pan. And with regard to that which you said in your question, although its mode of preparation proves that it is prepared in a shallow pan, what of it? I.e., since he is consciously uprooting its identity, how can it satisfy its owner's obligation?" Abai answers that Rava conforms to his line of reasoning, as Rava says, "The merciful one disqualifies an offering due to improper intent that is not recognizably false," i.e., when the physical properties of the offering itself do not prove that the intent is mistaken. The merciful one does not disqualify an offering due to improper intent that is recognizably false. Consequently, if one removes a handful from a shallow pan meal offering for the sake of a deep pan meal offering, even if he did so consciously, the offering remains valid and satisfies the owner's obligation. Mishnah. Failure to satisfy the daily offerings does not prevent sacrifice of the additional offerings. And likewise, failure to sacrifice the additional offerings does not prevent sacrifice of the daily offerings. And failure to sacrifice some of the additional offerings on a day when more than one is sacrificed, e.g., if it was both Shabbat and the new moon, does not prevent sacrifice of the other additional offerings. If the priest did not sacrifice a lamb in the morning as the daily offering, nevertheless, they should sacrifice a lamb in the afternoon as the daily offering. As failure to sacrifice one daily offering does not prevent sacrifice of the other. In all of these cases, if they failed to sacrifice one offering, they should still sacrifice the other. Rabbi Shimon said, "When does this halakha apply?" It applies at a time when the failure to sacrifice the daily morning offering was because they were prevented from sacrificing it due to circumstances beyond their control, or they failed to sacrifice it unwittingly. But if the priests acted intentionally and did not sacrifice a lamb in the morning as the daily offering, they should not sacrifice a lamb in the afternoon as the daily offering. Incense was burned twice a day, half a measure in the morning and half a measure in the afternoon. If they did not burn the half measure of incense in the morning, they should burn the half measure in the afternoon. Rabbi Shimon said, and in such a case, the entire measure was sacrificed in the afternoon. The reason for the difference between the daily offerings and the incense is that the daily service on a new golden altar is initiated only with the burning of the incense of the spices in the afternoon, at which time they would burn a full measure. And the daily service on a new altar of the burnt offering, on which the daily offerings were sacrificed, is initiated only with the daily morning offering. And use of a new table was initiated only with the arrangement of the showbread on Shabbat. And use of a new candelabrum was initiated only with the kindling of its 7 lamps in the afternoon. Gemara. The Mishnah teaches that the daily offerings and the additional offerings each do not prevent fulfillment of the mitzvah with the other. Concerning this, Rabbi Haya bar Avin raised a dilemma before Rav Hizda. In the case of a community that did not have the resources to sacrifice both the daily offerings and the additional offerings, which of them takes precedence over the other? The Gemara clarifies. What are the circumstances to which Rabbi Haya bar Avin is referring? If we say that he is referring to a case where the choice is between the daily offerings of that day and the additional offerings of that same day, it is obvious that the daily offerings are given preference, as the sacrifice of the daily offerings is more frequent than the sacrifice of the additional offerings, which are sacrificed only on special occasions, and the daily offerings are also sanctified. Rather, Rabbi Haya bar Avin must be referring to a case where they have enough animals for the daily offerings of today, and also for either the daily offerings for tomorrow or the additional offerings for today. In such a case, are the daily offerings given preference since their sacrifice is more frequent? Or perhaps the additional offerings are given preference because they are considered more sanctified because they are sanctified on a holy day. Rav Hizda said to Rabbi Haya bar Avin, the resolution to this dilemma can be derived from that which you learned in the Mishnah. Failure to sacrifice the daily offerings does not prevent sacrifice of the additional offerings. And likewise, failure to sacrifice the additional offerings does not prevent sacrifice of the daily offerings. And failure to sacrifice some of the additional offerings does not prevent sacrifice of the other additional offerings. What are the circumstances to which the Mishnah is referring? If we say that it is referring to a case where the temple treasury has all of the animals necessary for both offerings, and the only question is in terms of sacrificing one before the other, isn't it taught in a Bereta, from where it is derived that no sacrifice should precede the sacrifice of the daily offering of morning? The Bereta continues, It is derived from that which the verse states. And the fire upon the altar shall be kept burning thereby. It shall not go out. And the priest shall kindle wood on it every morning, and he shall lay the burnt offering in order on it, and shall cause the fats of the peace offering to go up in smoke upon it. Leviticus chapter 6, verse 5. The Rava says in explanation of this derivation in the Bereta that the term, the burnt offering, with the definite article, is referring to the first burnt offering of the day, which is the daily offering. Consequently, one may not sacrifice the additional offerings before the daily offering. 49b. Rather, it is obvious that the Mishnah is referring to a case where he does not have a sufficient number of animals for both offerings. And if it is referring to the offerings of that day, why does the Mishnah say that failure to sacrifice one does not prevent sacrifice of the other, since the daily offering is more frequent and it is sanctified, and the additional offerings are sanctified but are less frequent than the daily offering? The frequent offering are given preference. Consequently, failure to sacrifice the daily offering should prevent the sacrifice of the additional offerings. Rather, is it not referring to a case where the temple treasury does not have enough animals for both the additional offerings of today and the daily offering of tomorrow? And yet the Mishnah teaches that failure to sacrifice one does not prevent one from sacrificing the other. Evidently they are equal, and he may sacrifice whichever offering he chooses. This would resolve Rabbi Hiya bar Avin's dilemma. Abiye said to Rav Hizda, "That is not a valid resolution of the dilemma, as one can claim that actually the Mishnah is referring to a case where they have enough animals for all the offerings, and the Mishnah is referring to the issue of sacrificing one before the other. And with regard to that which poses a difficulty for you, based upon the Bereta that states that no sacrifice should precede the sacrifice of the daily offering of the morning, that Bereta is merely stating the mitzvah ab initio. The Gemara suggests, come and hear a resolution to Rabbi Hiya bar Avin's dilemma based upon a Mishnah. Arakin 13a. One maintains no fewer than 6 lambs that have been inspected and found to be unblemished in the chamber of the lambs, sufficient for Shabbat and for the 2 festival days of Rosh Hashanah, that in some years occur adjacent to it. The Gemara clarifies, what are the circumstances of this case? If we say that it is referring to a case where the temple treasury has enough animals for all of the offerings that should be brought, 6 lambs are not enough, as there are many lambs sacrificed for daily offerings and additional offerings on those 3 days. In total, 22 lambs are required, 2 each day for the daily offerings, 2 for the additional offering of Shabbat, 7 for the additional offering of Rosh Hashanah, and 7 for the additional offering of the new moon. Rather, is it not that the Mishnah is referring to a case where the temple treasury does not have enough animals for all of the offerings? And it is teaching that the animals that he does have are utilized for the daily offerings of all 3 days, rather than for the additional offering of Shabbat on the first of the 3 days. Consequently, one may conclude from it that the daily offerings of tomorrow are given preference over the additional offerings of today. The Gemara replies, no, this is not a valid proof, as one can claim that actually the Mishnah is referring to a case where the temple treasury has enough animals for all of the offerings of the 3 days. And this is what the Mishnah is saying when it mentions 6 lambs. One maintains for use as daily offerings no fewer than 6 lambs that have been inspected and found to be unblemished in the chamber of the lambs 4 days prior to their slaughter. Lambs sacrificed as other offerings do not have to be inspected 4 days prior to being slaughtered. And in accordance with whose opinion is this Mishnah? It is in accordance with the opinion of Ben Bagbag. As it is taught in a Bereta that Ben Bagbag says, from where is it derived that the daily offering requires inspection 4 days prior to its slaughter? The verse states with regard to the daily offering, you shall observe Tishmeru, to sacrifice to me in its due season. Numbers 28:2. And elsewhere with regard to the paschal offering, the verse states, on the 10th day of this month they shall take for them every man a lamb, and you shall keep it, Mishmeret, until the 14th day of this month. Exodus 12, verses 3 through 6. Consequently, it is derived by means of a verbal analogy that just as in the verse there, the paschal offering requires inspection 4 days prior to its slaughter, from the 10th of the month to the 14th. So too here, the daily offering requires inspection 4 days prior to its slaughter. This is not a requirement that pertains to all offerings. It is stated specifically with regard to the paschal offering and extended by means of a verbal analogy to the daily offering. The Gemara cites a discussion pertaining to the Mishnah cited earlier. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, with regard to these 6 inspected lambs, that must always be kept in the chamber of lambs, there ought to be 7, as there is a need for another lamb for the daily offering of the morning of the 3rd day of the week, since it cannot be inspected on Shabbat or the subsequent festival days of Rosh Hashanah, and therefore should be inspected and kept beforehand. Rav Ashi responded to Ravina, according to your reasoning, the correct number is not 7, but rather it is 8, as there is also the daily offering of the afternoon of Shabbat Eve that should also be counted. Ravina replied, that is not difficult, because the Mishnah is saying that after he sacrificed the daily offering of the afternoon, there must be 6 inspected lambs. Okay, that completes Menachot 49. Thank you.